we've created so many layers of process and bureaucracy that we actually have convinced ourselves that the only solution to our problems is to throw more people at the problems. This is absolutely ludicrous, asinine, and irresponsible.
This is the Expert Series podcast from the CVA Institute, Canada's premier defense and security think tank. I'm Josh Malm, and it's Thursday, June 12th, 2025.
I'm announcing today that Canada will achieve NATO's 2% of GDP target this year, half a decade ahead of schedule. And we will further accelerate our investments in years to come. We'll start by changing the way we support and invest in our armed forces. We will change the way we arm the men and women who serve.
On Monday, Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would meet NATO's long-standing defense spending target of 2% of GDP by the end of the fiscal year in March. The announcement marks a major acceleration in Canada's defense commitments ahead of next month's NATO summit. Here with me to unpack the announcement and its significance, we're joined by Vice Admiral Mark Norman, former commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. Mark touches on the challenge of spending quickly while fixing the procurement system, what he sees as the need to reduce reliance on the U.S. by deepening ties with European allies, and the opportunity to rebuild Canada's defense industrial base by leveraging domestic technology and talent. Be accelerating its defense spending to reach 2% of GDP by the end of the 2025-26 fiscal year. I think originally Mr. Carney had projected that our government might reach that by 2030 during the election campaign. So we can debate the merits of whether or not we're achieving 2% earlier, but based on what Mr. Carney said, getting to there within the fiscal year would be earlier than projected. That said, Mr. Norman, from your initial read and listen of the announcements and the readout that was given, what stood out to you in the defense announcements, and what do you think the public really needs to understand about it?
Well, I think the first comment I would offer is that I was quite struck by the Prime Minister's reflections on the strategic circumstances that Canada is facing and the world is facing more broadly. And I think that, you know, it was, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here. I know there's lots of politics around all of this and there's a lot of cynicism, but I really got a sense that he gets it and that there is a genuine commitment to fix a number of the things that are broken. I also, he made it very clear that this was going to be a long and difficult challenge, and that I think Canadians need to understand that, as I have said publicly on a number of occasions, it has taken us decades to screw this up. We are not going to fix it overnight. And yes, it's very encouraging to see the spending commitments. I think some of the other embedded decisions or inferences, I think, are also very positive. But there's lots of work that needs to be done, and there's lots of challenges. I would go as far as to say is there be dragons in some of these shadows that have yet to be explored. But we can talk about that.
Yes, so as they often say, Mr. Norman, the devil's in the details. So the announcement outlines a range of initiatives and investments, but of course there are obstacles to achieving those. You know, for instance, matching investments with personnel requirements in a recruitment and retention crisis. Our seeming desire to pivot away from the United States while having the shared duty of continental defense and wanting to achieve some of these targets rapidly. What would you say off the top of your head appear to be some of the major obstacles or challenges in achieving some of these investments?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a few, but the first thing I got to say is don't expect short answers. You've had me on before, so bear with me, and for your listeners, please bear with me. I will get to the point eventually. And the second thing I would say is Stop calling me Mr. Norman. You can call me Mark, or call me Admiral, but Mr. Norman, I don't even, that's my brother. Even my father is not Mr. Norman. So anyway, let's get on with it. So look, I think there are a whole series of challenges. There are some very upfront challenges, and I'll give you a couple, and then there are some more buried challenges. So in the upfront category, the first thing we have is we have a tension between wanting to spend money as quickly as possible and spending that money smartly. And we can unpack that. But those two things are not necessarily conducive, okay? In fact, the history of the armed forces, both older history and more recent history, is full of examples of stupid, rapid, impulsive decisions. And so we need to be very, very careful that we don't fall into that category. So finding that balance between speed and smart is going to be it's going to be tough. Another element of this, and you mentioned it, is disentangling ourselves from U.S. dependencies and the vulnerabilities associated with those dependencies. Okay, so that is a whole podcast in and of itself, but we can scratch on some of that. The next thing I would say is the whole issue around wanting to Canadianize as much as possible our industrial base, our supply chain, and really to truly create opportunities for Canadian industry, not false or artificial opportunities, which some people have said already in the last 24 hours, but I mean real genuine opportunities for Canadian industry. And I'm a huge advocate for Canadian defense industry. There is a lot more capacity and confidence out there than most people understand. And sure, there's a lot of things we can't do, and there's a lot of things we should probably never try to do, but there are an enormous number of things that we can do, and we do them very well. And we need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot, which is what we've been doing for decades. And then I guess the one of the other elements of this, which a lot of people have already touched on, is just the sheer volume of what is required across the multiple pillars that the Prime Minister laid out yesterday, and then magnify that across the entire machinery of government and all of the other initiatives that the government has committed to. And I just think that there are some real capacity throughput challenges, and you know, there will be choke points in all of this, and I think that we need to be mindful of those. So those are kind of my initial thoughts, and every one of those have layers and tangents to them. So thanks.
Cool. So one tangent I'd like us to reflect on perhaps is the bilateral relationship. So two questions there, but maybe we can start with Rearm Europe. So, you know, during the campaign, we heard some messaging that leaned into Canadian concerns about the United States, possibly even at times tapping into a sort of Canadian nationalist, or perhaps, I don't know if I would use the word anti-American sentiment, but, you know, what is one to think when the U.S. president uses terms like annexation? Do you think the rhetoric from the campaign has maybe now turned into, or could be turning into, actual policy? And could we actually be seeing a real shift towards that decoupling we were talking about from the U.S., potentially leaning more into European alliances or partnerships when it comes to defense?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. However, and let me unpack the however. You know, there's kind of a series of overlapping considerations here. I mean, obviously, there's the politics of this, and that tends to be on the more emotional end of the scale. But there are also some very pragmatic considerations. And so, yes, I do agree with the premise that there's kind of a carryover, if you will, from some of the patriotism, whether it was genuine or just the reflection of frustration at the moment. It doesn't really matter. It was there and it was palpable. And yes, I think that that is still, um, if I could be so bold, that is still good politics. Um, but it also is good policy. And here's why I think it's good policy. As the prime minister has pointed out, and 75 cents of every dollar we spend on capital primarily, and I'm going to take him at his word, goes to the United States. That is a vulnerability. If we were in business and we were either a supplier to somebody or a consumer of somebody, if you had 75% of your flow of goods or services dependent on a single customer, that in and of itself would cause the executive direction of that company to be a little nervous. They would want to diversify their client base, to use a business term, or diversify their supply chain. And so I think from that perspective, it is smart, even if you take away the underlying emotion of the politics of it. And as it relates to, the alternatives, see, one of the things has always been, and I said this just yesterday in a radio interview, and it carries over into other sectors of our economy. It's not just a defense issue. A lot of our north-south linkages are based, everybody says, based on history and tradition and everything else. Yeah, but you know what? They're also based on um, uh, simplicity and I'm going to be provocative and call it laziness. I don't mean the individuals themselves are lazy. I mean, it's easy, right? It's easy for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the sheer logistics of it. So, that carries over into the defense realm. Now, there's also some cultural aspects of it. And, I think this is where, I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge. And it's going to require some courage, and it's going to cause some people to be very uncomfortable. There is an underlying cultural bias in the armed forces and in D&D on the material side of the business with respect to, buying U.S. stuff and U.S. supply chains. And, there's lots of good arguments for that. And I'm not suggesting that those are not valid arguments, but there's also some vulnerabilities. I think what's happened is the situation we find ourselves in has put some light onto the vulnerabilities, and I think it's therefore more prudent that um, we take them seriously. I go back to one of the things I said in the last question. Let's not panic. Let's not do stupid things. But let's be prudent here and look at it. And I do believe that Europe and Asia, for that matter, I know that the Prime Minister spoke specifically about Europe, and I think it's a legitimate pursuit, especially when you look at the Rearm NATO, you will look at the NATO industrial strategy and all of those things. And, to be quite honest, NATO has always been a very Eurocentric entity. I mean, notwithstanding the dominance of the United States, that is an issue in and of itself. Um, when it comes to industrial opportunities and opportunities, we don't get a lot of opportunity in Canada. And at the same time, I go back to we've always pushed the easy button, which is to go north south. So I think this is all good. I genuinely believe it. I think there's real opportunity here. I don't think this is rhetorical. I don't think this is a bumper sticker. I think this has got some real legs to it, if I can put it that way. But again, not going to be easy, not going to be automatic. It's going to require a lot of hard work. Oh, and by the way, every month we wait for whatever, others are adding to the order books of those supply chains. So this is why We can't just do that. We cannot substitute one dependency for another dependency. And I'm not suggesting that that is implied in the government's intent. But for your listeners, I would say, look, there's no silver bullet here. And I genuinely believe and will advocate from the highest hilltop that the way forward has to include a significant and fundamental restructuring of Canada's defense industrial base and all of the policies, processes associated therewith. Because to be quite honest, what we have right now is just not going to get us where we need to be. So,
hoping we can speak at a bit of a broader level once again. And it's something you remarked about at the beginning of this discussion. Now, Prime Minister Carney in his speech made statements like, we want partnerships with reliable allies and stable democracies. He also made reference to myriad threat and challenges Canada faces. I think he may have used the phrase great power competition, or competition, which we hear so often. So from your perspective, what do you think the announcement might suggest about how the current government sees the international security landscape evolving?
Yeah, well, I don't want to pretend to be in their OODA loop or in their decision cycle, but I think he made a couple of very appropriate and insightful remarks. Some of them were politically pointed, and others were much more strategic in nature. But that's great. So, we are seeing a fundamental change, and so we either accept the change or we dig in and pretend that the change isn't happening. Stick our heads in the sand, so to speak. If we sidestep the issue of the domestic challenges that are facing our friends and neighbors to the south. I have opinions on those, but I'm not going to get into it. And to be honest, I don't even think they're relevant to the conversation. The reality is that beyond just that, we're seeing a shift in the behavior of the major powers. And we've been seeing this shift for a while. And yes, it's undeniable that the current behavior of the U.S. administration is accentuating that shift. Okay, they were not the catalyst for it. They may have, pushed it over the edge, so to speak, but it's been coming, and so the sophisticated characterization is exactly what the Prime Minister said, where he called it great power, the return of great power competition. And great power competition has historically and will continue to be premised on sort of, a series of underlying principles. One is economic might, military might, and the whole notion of blocks or blocks, power blocks, right? I've said before, you kind of imagine the game Risk that many of us older folks used to play when we were younger, and you start to see the creation of these geographic and ideological blocks, and it's playing out. I was just reading something this morning about Russia helping North Korea build next generation unmanned vehicles. Well, that's really friggin' helpful. Yes, thank you very much. But it just speaks to the evolution of the dynamics in these evolving blocks. So it is real. And so, Canada has to make a choice. We have historically prospered under the protection of two major colonial powers. I mean, if we strip away the history of the Anglo-Franco tensions of the early days of the creation of modern Canada, and we was okay. So under the protection of one empire, and then we kind of, lived under the protection of another empire. Well, the reality is, even if those empires themselves continued in the way they had, which they haven't, we ask ourselves a question: Is this how we see the future of Canada? And I think that's part of what is informing the Prime Minister and those around him. Is they're looking at this, saying it's time for us to carve out our own space, to find our own way, to set our own course. And I applaud that, because I think it's entirely appropriate, not just from a patriotic perspective, but from a very practical one. And if that means that we're going to redefine our relationship with Europe as we continue to grow new partnerships in Indo-Pacific, then great, so be it. Doesn't mean necessarily that we're going to completely abandon our relationship with the United States. And so people should not see these as binary choices. They're not. This is going to be evolutionary, and I think it's great. But I go back to, there'll be dragons, and none of this is going to be easy. So I'm not sure if that's the response you were looking for, but that's the best I got right now, Josh.
No, and it's excellent. Mark, the Prime Minister also mentioned during his speech that there could be more defense-related announcements to come, and that there could be more accelerations. People are speculating that during the upcoming NATO summit, there could be talks of getting to 3.5% as a new floor. So, I mean, what happens if Canada finally decides to get to 2%? The floor goes to 3.5%, and beyond that, with such major investments on the table, how do we actually ensure we have the personnel and infrastructure to meet some of those commitments?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot in there. So let's look at sort of three dimensions of how you laid out the question. The first one is, what are things we know of, and what are the things that could be included in the, I'll call it the shopping list. I don't mean that in any way to be pejorative, but I think it's useful for your listeners to get their heads around. And then let's talk about, okay, the strategic environment, and how, NATO may or may not want to change the goalposts. And then we'll talk about one of the underlying issues, this whole issue of capacity. So, first of all, we have not seen the full list of requirements. And this has been, for my entire career, and certainly the last decade and a half to 2 decades of my career, where I was working on these kinds of issues, just like people are working on them right now in NDHQ and elsewhere. We would see mitigated demand, or some other management term for reduced demand, because the raw demand was never accepted as being legitimate, and that was complete bullshit in my mind, because it was premised on an assumption that people were just, going around with gift cards through the aisles of Costco, and that's not how you design an armed force, and it's not how professionals are behaving. But there are a whole bunch of behaviors inside how we come up with the shopping list that are fundamentally flawed. That doesn't mean the individuals who are doing all the great work are flawed. It means the processes that they're trying to operate under are fundamentally flawed. So there is a lot more demand out there than people understand. And some will have a very negative reaction to that. And I understand that. It's like, for God's sake, does this ever end? Well, the reality is no. And it's not that it never ends in terms of expansion. It never ends, because if you're doing it properly, you're life cycling your capabilities and you're innovating and you're adapting, and all of those things are contributing to new capabilities. It's not enough to just, you know, decide to do something and then, you know, rub your hands together and say congratulations and not think about it again for another 20 years, which is typically what we do. So I'm not going to get into a rant. You can sense the rant starting. I'm going to stop it right there. Rant us, interrupt us, and um, let's go to the next. So the demand is there, and we can talk about it. Okay. So let's talk about now the strategic demand, which is the possibility of increased expectation of spending. And we're already seeing references to 3.5%. And I saw something just today with the Secretary General describing 5%, but it's not a 5% macro. It's 5% of certain elements of the investment plan, okay, at the NATO level. This actually all makes sense. And yes, it again, it will make a lot of people very uncomfortable, and it is arguably obscene amounts of money. But this stuff is not fantasy. It's not people out of control. It's people actually applying their best professional judgment and due diligence to assessments of the security demands of the coming decades, which goes back to where you look around the world and these power blocks, and you know, we don't need to name names, but we're in a evolvingly or increasingly tough place. So how can we respond? Well, we actually have capacity from a fiscal perspective, but and I'm going to pick up on something the Prime Minister said, and you know, he was quite explicit about it. You can't have one without the other. So you can't have the capacity to do all this without an economy that is healthy. The irony, and it was not him, it's just the irony of the economics of this, is that as your GDP, this is why the percentage of GDP is a flawed calculus for a variety of reasons. But you know, as your GDP grows and you try to create a stronger and more vibrant economy, well, then your liability on the defense spending side goes up commensurate to your growth. So now some would say, well, yeah, but so does your capacity. But the challenge is you're you know, you're in a bit of a stern chase, to use a nautical analogy. So you have to pace this properly. And one of the things that he said yesterday, and I'm going to paraphrase, was, yeah, and we're going to do this at our pace, and we're going to push back on NATO on a couple of things related to, as he said, the NATO accountants. And that's not Canada fighting the 2%, and it should not be characterized as such. It's actually trying to have a more sophisticated conversation, which we tried to do before, but we couldn't because we were always in the penalty box. It's not, there's no point arguing about the rules of the game when you're already in the penalty box. If you're out on the ice, well, then you can perhaps, you know, have a little more influence. So forgive me while I mix a bunch of metaphors together. So that's, you know, the second element of this. And then the third element, yeah, I love how you get to ask the short questions, and then I get the long, complicated answers.
That's why we have you on.
But the third element of this is not just our fiscal capacity, but it's our human capacity. And this, I have kind of two basic reactions to this. The first one is, I go back to what I said earlier. It's taken us decades to screw this up. And we've screwed it up in two ways. We've allowed the structure of the armed forces to not just erode or calcify or whatever negative analogy you want to use, but I mean, we've come as close to breaking it as I think we probably could. And arguably, and it's certainly something I was saying when I was serving, is the entire structure of the armed forces is fundamentally flawed to begin with. It is the rump of decades of trying to hang on to legacy structures. But you can't stop. It's like changing the wheels on the bus while it's driving down the highway or whatever you want to describe. So you've got what you got. You need to rebuild it. We need to reestablish the basis of what I would call the fighting capacity of the armed forces, and that's complicated in and of itself. The second problem is we've created so many layers of process and bureaucracy that we actually have convinced ourselves, rant coming, that the only solution to our problems is to throw more people at the problems. This is absolutely ludicrous, asinine, and irresponsible. Okay? And any organization in government that's trying to deal with another organization in government will point to the guys and gals on the other side and say, well, they're the problem. And in order for me to counter them, I need 10 more people because they're requiring me to do more paperwork. This is just ridiculous. And this is partly why we have some of the problems that we have. I don't know where these 1,400 new people are going that were announced yesterday into the Department of National Defense. I cringe. I'm sure the bosses that are looking to hire these 1,400 people have legitimate arguments for it. When I was scratching on this stuff, we were pushing 20,000 people in the public service, and half of them are just making the other 10,000 people's jobs more difficult by making them do more paperwork in order to fill out the paperwork. I know this is an overgeneralization, and I know it sounds like it's unfair to the people who are in there doing amazing work, but the system is broken. So that's my rant. We need, therefore, to stop throwing more fuel on that fire and actually change the fundamentals. I am encouraged by the early indications out of this government. I am concerned that it may take longer than it should, or that it might have a short-term negative effect on our actual capacity to move things. But I'm going to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But I think hiring more people in an already inflated organization is arguably irresponsible. That's my thought.
Well,
thanks.
Mark, if you haven't read any Kafka, you might enjoy. You have a similar disdain for bureaucracy. Listen, Mark, we're almost at time here, and we promised we'd keep this between 25 to 30 minutes. As you pointed out earlier in your answer to the question, I have enjoyed, rather casually asking you some very complicated questions and then watching you to try to diagnose and solve the problems in real time. Easy feat for sure. I want to thank you again for your time. And maybe before we wrap up, do you have any additional thoughts or recommendations, any key points you might like to touch on that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And all joking aside, I'm not known for short answers, as your listeners will appreciate. But things are seldom as simple as they seem. I'm going to take a couple minutes here, and I just want to talk about Canadian industry and some of the myths out there. And I really want to double down on what I said earlier about this, to me, being one of the key areas of real substantial opportunity. We have amazing capacity in this country to do some really cool things. Some of these are long-standing legacies of best practices and areas of historical strength that we have enjoyed in Canada from a military perspective. Okay. And I'll give you a couple of examples, and I won't apologize. You know, a couple of them are Navy. They're not all naval examples, but it's to give your listeners a sense of it. But we also have some really, really impressive areas of innovation and advanced technologies. And these are the kinds of things, both those legacy capabilities. But when I say legacy capabilities, by the way, I'm not talking about old shit. I'm talking about stuff that we've been really good at for decades, and now we're even better at. But people don't know it, and we don't. I'm going to use the word celebrate, or I go as far as to say we don't love it in our own Canadian context. And this is all like this. This permeates a lot of aspects of our lives in Canada. I mean, we love to celebrate Canadian hockey teams when they're in the Stanley Cup finals. That's great and it's exciting, and so we should. But we forget that we have Canadian teams out there every day playing in the equivalent of their Stanley Cup final, and they're not getting any love. Um, and in fact, their own government is putting up obstacles in their path. And this is real. I'm not exaggerating. So the kinds of things that the Prime Minister described yesterday with respect to some of these emerging technologies. We love to focus on the big shiny objects, and I've used that language before with you and others. And yeah, I get it. That's important, and they make up tens of billions of dollars of these spending requirements. But there's a lot of other things, and some of the ones he mentioned. You're talking about some of the issues around satellite technology, acoustic sensors, seabed stuff, anti-submarine warfare, sonars, signal processing. I mean, it's not just the actual sensors themselves, but one of our huge strengths has always been and continues to be in the algorithms and software that go in. And these are like really high tech sectors. This isn't about banging steel, as people call it. This is very at the high end of the value chain, not just from a commercial perspective, but from a warfighting perspective. And where the magic should be happening is when we're at the high end of the commercial value chain and we're at the high end of the warfighting value chain. Oh, and guess what? We are in a lot of those places, but we don't realize it and we're not investing in it. And in fact, goes one step further. We have a system that will allow people to get started. And then once they just got themselves, standing, we then pull the rug out from underneath them and force them to compete in an environment where they're going up against multinational apex predators. And they either don't have the fiscal capacity to do that, or they don't have the human capacity to do that, or, they're disadvantaged from a policy or procedural or process perspective. We have, I have said to anybody who will listen, I would love to see a library of Canadian-owned intellectual property in the defense and security sector. I don't think it exists. I'm not being cynical when I say that. And if we actually looked at that, we would probably go, holy crap. We can do all of that. Yeah, we can. And so this to me, perhaps an area for another discussion, but that you gave me a chance to kind of leave on that thought, and I hadn't really mentioned it. So thank you. But this I think is the real opportunity space. And I push back at people who will argue that Canadian stuff is crap. Okay. Yeah, maybe some is, but some stuff from other places is crap too. But just and I genuinely believe that part of the reason we're not getting the best out of Canadian suppliers is that we're not actually enabling those suppliers to give us their best. I can tell you in my travels in my professional life, both in uniform and outside, we are one of the very few advanced economies or advanced democracies that do this to themselves. It is a self-inflicted injury, and we've got to stop it, and we got to stop it fast. I will have no patience for stupid decisions in that domain, because it will constrain our ability as a country to get where we need to be. So thanks.
And that's all for today's episode. The Expert Series is released every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more about the CDA Institute, follow us on social media, visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on Canadian defense and international security. If you have comments or feedback about what you heard in today's edition, email Josh at cdainstitute.ca. I'm Josh Malm. Until next time.